Okay, it's time to start talking about resources. This is the introduction to Experience 4. And as you saw in looking at the Timmons model of the entrepreneurial process, resources are a key critical component. And in this introduction, I'm going to give you a quick primer on resources and get you prepped and ready for the readings and the videos. Okay, so a natural kind of logical starting point would be to just sort of break this idea of resources into two primary categories, which I would say would be tangible and intangible resources, and then kind of delineate what those look like for the entrepreneur.
So tangible resources really are things like money, equipment, land, physical space, vehicles, people, partnerships. Those are all things that you can touch. You can hold them in your hand. We can hold lots of money in our hand. Those are all things that we have or can get access to. Tangible things. Money, obviously cash, equipment, machinery, land, real estate, building, physical space, the building, the vehicles. If you're going to start a food truck business, you're going to have a vehicle. People, your startup team, that key component of the Timmons model, the team. But people is not just the team, it's also employees. It's also people that you can access their network and their expertise. It's things like accountants and bankers and attorneys and a board of directors and a board of advisors, people that can help you. They're a resource for you to grow your business. Partnerships, a good way of thinking of this is, what kind of alliances or partnerships would help me build my business? And if I had access to those resources, how would it help me? A good example of partnerships for startups, there are, I've worked with a number of craft brewery startups, and some more successful craft breweries have created distribution networks, and they have the trucks, and they have the salespeople, and they have the relationships with the restaurants and the stores, and they're able to provide those services to startup craft breweries for a fee, obviously, but that's a resource that I don't have to necessarily own as a startup craft brewery. I want to bottle my beer or can it and get it into those locations. If I want to do that, I'm going to have to build that supply, that supply chain infrastructure. And in this case, I might be able to partner with a strategic partner, another craft brewery that offers those services, and they can do it for me. So those are the kind of partnerships we're talking about. And so that's not an exhaustive list, that's an illustrative list, but that's again, it's people think money first when they think resources, but when you talk about tangible resources, there's all these various things that you got to think about getting access to and either controlling or owning. When we talk about intangible resources, we're talking about things like networks, social and professional networks. We're talking about experience, expertise, skills. We're talking about intellectual property, which is patents, trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets, those kind of things. Your business model, your business plan. And then last but not least, kind of emotional resources. Networks are really, really super important. Having access to a network socially and professionally gives you access to people, connections, resources that are going to be really, really valuable for your startup venture. And I think the reality is, if you don't have a network, a really strong network that's got both good, strong connections and some weak connections where you sort of acquaintances, but enough to connect with them and ask them for help, but not you're not close friends. If you don't have that network, I think as an intangible resource when you start a business, I think you're at a disadvantage. Obviously, expertise, skills, experience, really, really critical to have as a part of your startup, whether it's you or your, the intangible that's brought in a team. And then, I want to jump back to that emotional resource because I think intellectual property pretty straightforward, business model pretty straightforward, but that intangible resource of having the emotional resilience and the emotional reservoir to undertake a startup. It takes you did the personal assessments. We looked at risk taking and your innovativeness and your self-efficacy, your proactiveness. Those are all really important things to have, but you also need to really be committed to going after a business and have to have the emotional resilience and emotional reservoir to be able to deal with the startup process, because it is incredibly draining and incredibly taxing. And I think if you don't have that as an intangible resource, I think you're in trouble. So that's a really quick look at a way to categorize resources, because they oftentimes just get lumped together. And I really think it's a lot more than money, and it's a lot more than just your network, and it's a lot more than just the people. There's a lot of aspects to starting a business when we think about resources. And if we're going to own or control those resources, I think we need to know what they are, and we need to be able to figure out how to identify them effectively. Okay, so how do we get resources? I want to talk about three things. First, let's sort out this idea of controlling versus owning. Typical entrepreneurs think, hey, I've got to own everything, and you really don't. What you need to be able to do is access the resources. You don't have to have all the expertise in-house necessarily, but if you have a board of advisors that you can access them and pick their brain and how did you handle this situation, you're in essence controlling that resource and not having to own it. Another good example is access to somebody else's network. I'm thinking about a company that was trying to create a strategic alliance with another company, and the CEO told one of his board members, who was one of the investors in the company, about it, and he said, God, I wish you'd have told me that earlier. You've been trying for months to get the meeting with that CEO. He's my best friend. I play golf with him 3 times a year. I'll connect you. And so after months of trying, within a couple of days, the CEO had a meeting and was on a plane to London to meet with that company, and it ultimately resulted in a key strategic alliance that helped that business grow. And that's another example of, you don't have to own a resource. You don't have to have somebody on staff 24/7. You don't have to have access to all the physical assets, but if you can control them for some period of time, you have the benefit of them. And years ago, a really successful computer company was started based on that very concept, that companies couldn't afford to buy these supercomputers back in the 60s when they were $1 million or $3 million, but he created a company where he leased space on these gigantic supercomputers for a fraction of the cost of ownership, and built a really successful company on the concept of you don't have to own it, you just have to have control of it for a certain period of time. And so I think entrepreneurs need to think, how do I get access to a resource and control it versus having to own everything? Second piece in terms of accessing resources is just being resource creative. And what do I mean by that? Let me use an example. I was consulting for a company in the late 90s. They were a startup company, early stage company. They've been in business 8 months. In 8 months, they'd already done over $1 million in revenue. And when I was taking a tour of the plant, I was really knocked out by their production line. They made plastic tubing. And I was, impressed enough to say that, to them, this is really cool. This must have cost you a lot of money. And they said, oh, no, it really didn't. They said, we couldn't afford to buy this new. We could not afford to buy it used, and we weren't going to let that stop in the way, get in our way of starting this business. We were totally committed. We were going to do this. We just didn't have the money to get what we wanted. So instead, we built it ourselves. We went to garage sales. We went to the scrapyard. We cobbled it together, and for a third of the cost of used, we put in a production line, and it's not perfect, but it's working pretty well. And even better is we kind of built some tweaks into it that the manufacturers don't offer, but based on our experience, we thought would be helpful for us. And I was just blown away by that. I was I was even more impressed after that. That's the idea of resource creativity. It's how do I access resources? How do I create things when I don't have everything I need? And good entrepreneurs are resource creative. Garner Holt here in the city of San Bernardino, Garner Holt Productions, he put together a very successful company on a shoestring. He never bought anything new. He begged and borrowed. He traded. He bartered. He did all kinds of things. He was creative with his resources. That leads into the concept of bootstrapping, and you're going to read about bootstrapping. But my favorite example, one of my favorite examples of bootstrapping, is the company TapOut. Charles Lewis, who helped found that company, they didn't raise capital. They took a small amount of money that they'd saved up. They bought T-shirts. They went and sold them out of the back of their car at mixed martial arts events back in the early days of that industry. And the money they made selling those shirts, they reinvested, bought more shirts, and they continued that cycle and continued to make, sock away profit and build up a nest egg, and then ultimately got outside financing. I mean, they built that from the back of their car to a company that was doing over a couple $100 million in revenue. They bootstrapped it. And so accessing resources, you don't have to have everything. You can start a company by bootstrapping. You don't have to have all the resources, but it's how creative you are, how hungry you are in terms of moving forward. And don't get caught up in, I have to have everything right away. There's ways around that. When it comes to raising money, because if we go back to money being like, hey, that's the big dog, that's the resource that everybody focuses on, yeah, you're going to have some money. It's either going to have to be some money from your savings, it's going to have to be some money from friends and family, or you're going to have to go out and take out a loan, or you're going to have to get an equity investment from angel investors or venture capital investors. And I'll describe what each of those are, but let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of debt and equity. Debt's really simple. You're repaying money with interest over a specified term. What's good about that is when a bank loans you money, they don't want any ownership interest in your business. They don't want any stock. All they care is that you're going to repay the loan on time. That's it. That's an incredible value for you because you keep 100% of your business. The cons of loans is you got to repay the money every month on time. And for a startup company, that's a nail-biting experience because if you're not doing so well, you got to be able to repay that loan. You got to have a capital reserve to repay that loan. So that's a challenge, and it's not easy to get a loan. I was meeting with one of our California state representatives in Sacramento yesterday, and she basically said a lot of people in my district want to start a business, but they can't get access to capital. They can't get a loan, and it's a hard thing to tell our government representatives that sometimes people just don't qualify for loans. It's not easy to get a loan because you have to have good credit and you have to meet some criteria, which we're going to talk about later on in this guided tutorial. But debt has some absolute pros, but it has cons as well. But it's not easy to get, and it can take a while to get a loan processed. But again, getting a loan, if you qualify, it's great because you're not giving up any ownership interest in your business. If you're taking on equity, you're giving up ownership in exchange for funding. The great thing is there's no obligation to repay the funds in return for that ownership. You're getting the money, you're giving them stock, and they're going to get their return on investment when ultimately the company is liquidated. We'll talk about that. So you're getting the money with not having to pay it back, essentially, in the short term. Ultimately you're going to pay it back, and you're going to return that investment, but you don't have to pay it back on a month-to-month basis. You don't have to worry about it. That's a beautiful thing. However, you are going to give up ownership. You're going to give up some level of control of your business, and your pie is going to get a little bit smaller. So you're going to have this slices out of the pie for somebody else. And obviously, getting the money and getting it in large amounts and not having to pay it back except for later on down the road when the company is sold and the stock is liquidated, that's a great thing. But giving up ownership for a lot of people, that's a deal breaker right there. And you lose a little bit of control. If somebody's got significant ownership in your company and they're on your board of directors, they're going to have input into how you run the business. Equity is also not easy to get unless the equity is coming from friends and family. But going through angel investors, which are high net worth individual investors who are typically successful entrepreneurs or successful business executives, or venture capitalists, which are firms that manage large pools of money that are invested in startup and early stage companies. Going through a process that with them is not a simple task, and it is not a simple, hey, we're just going to write you a check. There's a courting process, there's a due diligence process, and it can take months to raise a round of funds from those types of folks. So there's certainly a disadvantage in terms of the time it takes to raise equity capital. So I think that's a good, really quick overview of debt versus equity. Let me go back to that concept of is it better to control all or part of your business? Because this is a stumbling block for a lot of entrepreneurs. Do you want the whole pie or do you want a slice? If you feel like you can grow your business organically over time and have it be a substantive business and retain full control, that's a great thing. I was in Silicon Valley last week. I was talking to a venture investor, and his philosophy was everything's got to be scaled up quickly, got to move fast, got to get market saturation, and we got to be successful right away. And it's going to take a huge infusion of capital to these businesses to do it. So they have to give up some, a piece of the pie. And the concept there is, if that's the only way to be successful with that business, is to scale it quickly and take on outside capital and grow it, and it grows to that level, as you can see by comparison to these two graphics, your slice, your 60% of the pie in that example is actually larger than 100% of the organically grown company. And so that's a trade-off that an entrepreneur has to make, is do they want the whole slice or do they want just the pie, the entire pie? And if you decide you want the entire pie and it limits your growth, you might have actually been better off to take less of the pie and grow faster to where the value's grown. The size of the pie got bigger. Your slice is smaller, but the overall size got bigger, and you benefited more. Personal choice. 9 out of 10 entrepreneurs I meet want 100% of the pie, and in some cases that's the right move. In other cases it's the absolute dead wrong move. They really could use the outside investment of capital, which can help them scale the business up more rapidly, get more market saturation, more penetration, beat the competitors, and grow the pie to a much larger size to where their 60% or their 40% is much more valuable than if they had retained 100% and grown much more slowly. So that's an important concept to be aware of and to think about from an entrepreneurial perspective, because it does relate to resources. It's, am I going to secure resources that are going to help me grow? And if so, how fast? And what implications does that have for me as the value that's being created and what I'm going to retain in monetary terms? I want to kind of switch gears and talk about teams a little bit. The Timmons model features teams as a key component of the entrepreneurial process, and it's a tremendous resource also. In my mind, teams are a huge part of your resource base. I want to talk a little bit about the characteristics of good teams to start with. You're going to read about this, but here's my take, having built multiple teams and seen a lot of teams being built, is it all boils down to some characteristics. And I think there's really about 4 to 6 characteristics. But to me, good teams start by being built on complementary skill sets. And I always tell people, if you have 5 Kobe Bryants on a team, there's not enough basketball to go around for 5 Kobe Bryants. You have to have a complementary skill set. You have to have a scorer. You have to have somebody that's good at distributing the ball. You have to have the good inside presence, the rebounder. You have to have all those things coming together. It's like a good recipe. It's got to come together. Complementary ingredients, complementary skills. So when you, as an entrepreneur, building a team, you need to be aware of who you are, what your skill set is, and you need to know what your business needs. Really, really important. What complementary skill sets do you need to build into the team? And I'm going on the assumption that teams generally, although not always, are an advantage for an entrepreneurial venture. They increase the odds of success, and you'll read about that. Good teams have shared values. They are not so disparate. They're not identical, but they're not so disparate that they tear apart. They share the same values about how they will work together and how the business will operate. Third, their commitment is synchronized. They are all committed to the business in the same way. I've worked with a number of businesses that have kind of torn apart because the founding team of 3 to 5 people, let's say, were not equally committed. One CEO I worked with, his founding team just fell apart because probably a third of the team wasn't willing to work 18 to 20 hours a day when the going got tough. And that created tension and strife and disagreements and rancor, and it just unraveled from there, in addition to all the other pressures of being in a startup environment. So a commitment of team members that's synchronized. They're working together. They're all committed at the same level. Teamwork is essential. That goes without saying, but good teams find a way to work together because it's not always going to be rosy, and they value working together. They respect each other. Respect is a huge element. You don't have to love everybody, but you have to respect them. You have to respect their skills, their opinion, and want to work with them in that regard. The last piece of the puzzle I throw in there is integrity. Good teams share a common bound of integrity. We are going to do things a certain way because if we don't, it's going to undermine the business, and one weak link will break the chain, and everybody will pay for it. So I think it's really important that you think about these characteristics, because in building a team, it's not just about picking people that you think are nice or you're going to get along with, or hey, they got great experience. You got to think about the broader perspective of some of these, what I would almost call soft skills, but characteristics that good teams have. Second piece is forming teams. I've seen teams formed in a lot of ways. I've formed my teams based on my personal experience and tapping in to my network, but mostly I built my team here at Cal State San Bernardino by bringing together people that I had worked with, and we had been on teams together before. We also had shared values. I knew their commitment levels. I knew their teamwork approach. I knew I respected them. I understood where they came from in the integrity standpoint, and they had skills that I had or that I didn't have. So it formed a good dynamic. But I formed the team that way, specifically and mindfully. I've seen a lot of teams formed haphazardly or based on friendship or things like that. A local craft brewery I work with right now, they formed based on friendship. The founders formed based on friendship. And I'm not saying that you can't do that. I think they come together in a lot of different ways. I think if you focus on forming the team with an eye towards the characteristics, then it doesn't matter the source of the teams. You're getting a good fit. So they form in a lot of different ways. I've seen students especially form teams based on proximity or just solely based on friendships, and they don't consider all these other dynamics, and inevitably those teams have problems. The last concept on teams I want to stress is unequal equals. Every team has to be equal in commitment and working together for the objectives of the business. But the reality is there's going to be one leader. There's a top dog. There's somebody calling the shots. You can't have 2 CEOs in a company. Not everybody brings the same thing to the team in terms of experience. Not everybody should be compensated equally. Not everybody should be equal owners. The pie should be divided up based on contributions and what people are going to bring now and in the future. The quickest way to destroy a team is to treat everybody equally from the perspective, especially from the perspective of ownership. I'll use 2 examples. The manufacturing company I cited earlier was 3 family members. And a few years into the business, I was still helping them. Things started to go south. 2 of the brothers were having problems getting along. One of them was the CEO. And he and his cousin had brought the capital to the business, and they had the majority of the expertise. And when they divided up the ownership of the company at the very beginning, they divided it equally. And the brother that was the third partner brought the lease to the table and ended up being the problem, and was creating all kinds of problems for the business. And in fact, he was actually actively undermining and sabotaging the CEO. And the CEO, being the older brother, didn't want to fire him, even though we advised him that that was what he needed to do. It didn't mean that his brother was going to lose his ownership. It just needed to get him out of the business. Fire him. He was an employee. He could be fired. He'd still retain his board seat, all that stuff. But the family dynamic's strong. It was tough to deal with. And it basically, derailed that company for several years because they treated him equally when he wasn't. He brought the lease to the table. He got, brought no money, brought really no expertise, and he was treated equally. You got to have unequal equals on a team. Doesn't mean he's not part of the team. Doesn't mean he's not equal in the commitment. Doesn't mean he's not going to share in the rewards commensurate with his portion of the business. But no startup team is equal from that perspective, especially in terms of how you slice the pie. So I think it's an important thing to think about when you're endeavoring to start a business in that regard. I want to talk a little bit about entrepreneurial finance, part of the resource equation, and hit about 5 key points, which I'm going to elaborate on a little bit more. But let's start with the idea that you as an entrepreneur have to be tuned into resources, and you have to be tuned into the financial aspect of it. And why entrepreneurs struggle with that is simply this, in my experience. Numbers aren't sexy. It's not as fun as dealing with customers, products, employees, scoring that big contract, going out and marketing, selling the business, selling the products, the excitement, the adrenaline. Numbers just aren't that exciting for most entrepreneurs. And so because they're not that exciting, they pay less attention to them. And that can get you in trouble. So I think you need to recognize that up front, that even though may not be the most exciting area of business to you, you got to pay attention to it. And in particular, you got to pay attention to the bottom line versus the top line. What's the top line? That's your revenues. That's the money coming in. The bottom line, that's what your net is, your net profit. At the end of the day, after everything's taken care of and accounted for, that's what's left over. Here's where companies get in trouble. Entrepreneurs love sales. They love making sales. And they pay attention, a lot of attention to that top line. Problem is, that's not just the only thing. Got to pay attention to the bottom line. Let me use an example again. My manufacturing company, the plastics tubing company, the resource creative guys that had slicing the pie problems and unequal problems. They had another problem too. One of the reasons why they originally engaged me to work with them was because they were having cash flow problems, which we'll talk about. But it emanated from a top line versus bottom line focus. Being new in business, they were totally focused on sales, getting customers in the door. And they did whatever they had to get those customers in. They were focused on the top line, revenue. As a result, they took in a lot of crappy customers that, had they done their due diligence, had they really looked into those customers, had they done real extensive credit checks, they would have found out those customers were not going to pay them, or if they were going to pay them, it was going to take a long time. And as a result, even though they had over $1 million in sales in the first 8 months of the company, when I joined them, they had over $200,000 of accounts receivable that was outstanding, 120 of which at that time was 120 days late. In fact, I think most of it was between 90 and 120 days, so it wasn't all over 120 days. That's bad news. So they were starving. They had run out of cash, which is why they really needed me to help them. And it all started obviously there were some system problems and follow-up and accounts receivable management, things like that. Tons of problems. But it started because if we looked at their customer base, they had a lot of crappy customers. And to get sales, because they weren't monitoring a lot of their sales, one of their sales reps, they were giving up a lot of margin on those sales. So by the time they got down to the bottom line, nothing left over. Bad focus on the top line, coupled with a lot of other problems, really resulted in almost a disastrous. It was a disastrous situation. It almost put them out of business. They did survive. We were able to turn things around, but I really strongly believe it started because they were more focused on the top line and not the bottom line. Sometimes you got to not take a customer. Sometimes you got to take a more profitable customer. Sometimes you got to understand your cost structure and what impact it has on the bottom line. And it's not just about making sales. Gross margin's a part of that. We're going to go into gross margin, so I'm just going to introduce it as a concept here. But you got to understand your gross margin. You also have to understand your cash flow cycle, which I'm going to elaborate on in a moment as well. And last but not least, a piece of the entrepreneurial finance component that not covered in your readings, that if I can remember correctly, is this idea of what I call the 5 C's of credit. How you're evaluated by lenders and investors. Let's talk about gross margin. You guys all know this. You've been through finance. You've been through accounting. Gross margin is revenue minus cost of goods sold. So your gross margin percentage is computed from that. If we sell a cup of coffee for $3.20 and our cost, our cost of goods sold is $1.20, our profit is $2, we've got a really nice gross profit margin of 63%. Why is gross margin so important? Gross margins are wonderful because they provide us with a lot of flexibility. They allow us to make mistakes. If we have a robust gross margin, we can make some mistakes and survive them. If we're really running close to the edge, we make a mistake or two and we might be gone. So if you ever watch that show on Channel 7, ABC 7, Shark Tank, great show. They talk, the concept of slicing the pie, and do you want the whole grape or do you want the slice of the watermelon? My whole thing about slicing the pie, that comes up on that show. And they are really interested in what's your gross margin on your product. You're selling a product, what's your gross margin? They want to see a robust gross margin because they know if robust gross margins means we're probably going to have a good, strong net profit margin. As long as we're efficient, we control our costs down below the gross. And they know it gives us some flexibility in pricing. So if we have a competitor that comes in and undercuts us in pricing, we've got a lot of margin to make some adjustments on pricing if we have to, on a case-by-case basis, if we have to get into price war. And they know it's going to, hey, if we got a robust gross margin, we can make some mistakes, we can make some false steps, and we can survive them. And the better our gross margin is, the more profit typically we're going to show at the net, and that's a beautiful thing. So gross margin is really, really important. When I talk about opportunities, what the difference between an idea and an opportunity in those 5 conditions, we talk about a business model and sustainable, good money-making characteristics. Gross margin is a part of that conversation. Do you have a good gross margin? Cash flow cycle I mentioned earlier. Let's just talk a little bit about that. You as an entrepreneur, when it comes to resources, you got to understand the concept of cash flow, and you got to understand when cash comes in and when cash goes out. And you got to have modeled it and projected it when you're starting a business. You have to know that you have cash on hand, and as soon as you order materials to make your products, and you have to pay employees, and you have to pay overhead, and you have other cash outlays, that happens while you're producing your product. And then the goods get produced, and then they get sold, and there's a little bit of a lag time between when they're in inventory and they're sold. And then there's a lag time when your customers pay you. Hopefully it's not 90 and 120 days like our plastics manufacturing company, but it's going to be, in many cases, at least 30 days. Unless you're an all-cash business, and that's a beautiful thing. So you got this cash flow cycle, and you got to understand the cash flow cycle and what it means to your business, which means at the startup phase, even though we're not going to do it in this class, you have to understand your cash inflows and cash outflows very intimately, and you have to model them or do cash flow projections for specific periods. I recommend doing the monthly for the first year and then quarterly thereafter, but it's the operational cash flow. Cash is king. Cash is the lifeblood of the business, and if you don't understand your cash flow cycle intimately, you're going to be in trouble. So really, really important concept to be thinking about. Last but certainly not least in the overview is that this idea that lenders evaluate you in a particular way. If you're seeking an SBA loan or a loan from another financial institution, they're going to use essentially the 5 C's of credit. They're looking at your capacity, your character, your capital, the conditions, and the collateral. Capacity is really nothing more than the cash flow of the business. Does the venture generate enough cash on a monthly basis to pay all of its bills, and then after that's done, service the debt? You got to pay back the loan. After all your other expenses are taken care of, do you have enough money left over to pay the debt? That's capacity. The second piece is character. It says integrity on the screen, and what that means is, do you pay your bills on time every time? That's your credit history and your credit score. They're using your credit history and your credit score as a proxy for your character, your integrity in meeting your obligations. The third C, capital, says net worth. Really, capital is your net worth, but it's also the capital you're infusing into your business. If you watch Shark Tank, oftentimes they'll ask the investors, well, how much money have you put into the business? What's your investment? If you seek a loan from a financial institution as a startup, they're going to ask you, what's your injection into the business? Typically, SBA lenders and others look for at least a 30 to 33% capital injection. So if you need $100,000 for your startup, they'll say, well, we really would like to see you put $30,000 in. That's your down payment. That's your sharing of the risk. Conditions are the external conditions. It's the economy, what's happening locally, nationally, regionally. And lastly, collateral. They're looking at, what assets do you have to secure the loan, right? Lenders would obviously desire to, if they loan you $100,000, they'd love to see $100,000 collateral, because if you default on the loan, they can take the collateral and they can liquidate it and they can get their money back. They're limiting their exposure, so collateral is a big part of it. If you go through SBA lending programs and things like that, the collateral is important but not a deal breaker. But it's an important piece of it, and you have to understand too that they're not going to value collateral at book value, at the full value. They're going to look at it as after a year it's been used, it's depreciated highly, and when we have to liquidate, if we have to liquidate this loan and we have to liquidate your collateral, we're going to get pennies on the dollar. And so they're going to oftentimes want to see more than 100% collateral coverage. But those are the 5 C's that lenders look at. People that are providing debt financing. If you're looking at angel investors, venture investors, they're not looking at all those. In particular, they're looking at 2 pretty strongly. One is the capacity. They're really looking at, does this business have the capacity not to repay a loan, but to grow at a rate that it's going to be able to return my investment. So if I give you $100,000, I really want to be able to get my money back from you in 3 to 5 years, my investment returned, through a liquidity event, which is the company being sold, it going public. I mean, somebody invests in your company, takes stock shares. You're not a publicly traded company. They can't sell them until there's an acquisition or a public offering. So they're looking, does the business have the capacity to be successful? Does it have the capacity to be sustainable? Does it have the capacity to grow at a rate that's going to allow the company to be acquired or sold or go public in 3 to 5 to 7 years maximum, so I can get my return on investment? I can liquidate my equity in the company and get my money back. That's what they want. They're also looking at your character, strongly looking at your character. What's your background? What's your experience? Are you a reputable person? What's your credit history? They're concerned about, do you have a criminal record? You've got to be upfront with them if you have any dings in your background, because they will find it out through their due diligence process. And venture capitalists and angel investors all do an extensive due diligence process, which includes a background check on you. And if you're not upfront and it comes out later in the background check, you are not going to get the money from them. It's that simple. And they're also interested in what kind of skin you have in the game. What money have you put in? They don't like to take 100% of the risk. They're always more comfortable in evaluating you when you've put some money into the game. You've put 10,000 in, you built the prototype. You put 20,000 in of operating funds to do some market testing. Whatever it is, they like to see that. And so, really, when you're talking about equity investors, angel investors, venture capital investors, they're not looking at all the C's, but capacity, character, and capital, and conditions to some degree are important to them. Collateral, not so much. Because they're betting big and they're figuring it's either gonna be big, it's gonna be average, or I'm gonna lose everything on it, and who knows what's gonna happen. So that's how lenders evaluate you from the perspective of the 5 C's of credit. That's how equity investors would evaluate you from the perspective of the C's of credit. Not all 5, but the C's of credit.
Okay, so that should wrap it up for the quick introduction to the concept of resources here in Experience 4. Next steps for you are to tackle the readings, the video, the discussions, and work on your business model canvas / business concept profile projects. As I mentioned before, at the end of each experience, I'm always available for questions or clarifications, or if you want to reach out to ask questions or clarify concepts or get input on your projects, feel free to join the office hours or reach out to me individually and we'll get you taken care of. So good luck here in Experience 4.